Hello and good afternoon, TVI viewers. Welcome to Crossroads with Neethan and Shan. As you know, Crossroads is a weekly talk show dedicated to discussing a variety of topics that are relevant to the social, economic, political, and cultural advancement of Tamil Canadians. Immigration policy is one of the most defining policies that define our country as Canada. There has been a number of changes to immigration policies in the past decade in Canada, particularly focusing on sponsorship and citizenship. So on today's episode of Crossroads, we are discussing these important changes, and who else would be better to discuss it with is two lawyers. So we have A.V. Go, who is the Executive Director of Metro Toronto Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario, and Shalini Konanur is the Executive Director and Staff Lawyer with South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario. So you serve diverse communities through a legal aid framework supporting communities. So this is the best couple we can have to talk about the impact of these changes. But firstly, let's talk about what these changes are. Because it's as people who are engaged in the community, it was hard enough for us to be keeping track of the changes that have come through in the last 10 years, because most of them didn't come as immigration changes. So Shalini, why don't you start with telling us a bit about the changes that have come in the sponsorship realm of citizenship and immigration?
Sure, and I can definitely say that it would be difficult for people to keep track of all of the changes, because in sponsorship there have been so many over the past 10 years that I think a lot of people don't know what the sponsorship process looks like now. So first of all, sponsorship into Canada is still a program about family reunification. So it allows you to sponsor either a spouse or a partner, common law partner, conjugal partner, parent, grandparent, or child. Those are the huge areas that it generally covers. There's a little bit more, but those are the big areas. One of the first big changes has been to spousal sponsorship. So now when you sponsor somebody, many of the people who land in Canada don't land as permanent residents, they land now as conditional permanent residents. So that's been one big change. Another pretty huge change that's impacting a lot of people is the way that parent sponsorship is now conducted. And the idea that you can no longer simply put in a parent sponsorship application. There are now quotas, and there are time periods where immigration will not accept applications. So there is strategy around trying to do parent sponsorship. Another huge thing that's happened is, and this is particularly troubling for our own communities, is that before you would be able to sponsor children under the age of 22. That number has now dropped to 19. And there's no longer an exception for children over 19 who are still in full-time studies. Even if they're dependent on their parents, they're not considered children and cannot be sponsored. And so those are some of the huge changes around spousal sponsorship, sponsoring children, and parent sponsorship, and we'll get into more details.
We'll talk about those in a bit more detail. Now, citizenship, there's been also a number of changes to how you apply to citizenship, but also who's considered citizen and so on, right?
Well, some of the changes that have already happened, one of the huge change, of course, is the fee increase. So now it's going to cost you like around like $630 just to apply for citizenship, which is a lot of money, especially if you're low income. Some of the major changes have not yet come into effect. So we anticipate changes sometime this summer. So for instance, before, if you're between the age of 18 and 55, you don't need to pass, I guess, the English proficiency. You don't have to show that you have sufficient knowledge of English and knowledge of Canada in order to pass the citizenship test. However, they have now
if you're outside that age.
Yeah, sorry. Before it was between the age of 14 and 65. Now they kind of limit the group to 18 and 55. So it means for those who are between the age of 55 and 64, they will now have to meet the requirement. Another change is, major change will be around the residency requirement. So right now, if you lived in Canada without a permanent resident status, like, for instance, you came as a refugee and then you got refugee status and then you applied for immigration status, or you came as a live-in caregiver and then at some point you become a permanent resident. The time you spent in Canada before you became a permanent resident count up to 1 year. But after the new change comes into effect, those time, like those days you spend as a non-permanent resident will not count anymore. And also, right now it's you can apply for citizenship if you have lived here for 3 years in a period of 4 years. Under the new change, you have to live here for 4 years in a period of 6 years. So automatically, you have to wait 1 more year before you can apply.
Okay. So it's going to take longer. It's going to cost you more.
Cost you more, and more people will fail.
More people are going to be, so if you have a senior at the age of 60, they would still have to pass the.
Right. Well,
test,
provided
right?
the seniors, they will come to Canada in the first place because of the changes to the sponsorship.
First of all, that's fine. And in terms of sponsorship, let's talk a bit about the spousal one. I just recently saw a Facebook post. I think it's a reliable source. It says a guide to immigration around how to see if it's a fraud marriage or not. And it's an absolutely ridiculous document. Is that a government document?
It is a government document. It's an internal document, I believe, advising immigration officers how to assess whether spousal sponsorships were genuine or not. And the reality is that assessment now of whether marriage is genuine is becoming even, the bar to get over that hurdle of convincing immigration that your relationship is genuine has become extremely hard for a lot of clients. I can tell you that just this morning we saw 4 walk-in clients whose applications were rejected for sponsorship, all on the basis that the immigration officer thought that their marriages were not genuine. And so that document you're talking about gives you a good idea of the kinds of things that immigration is looking at to figure out whether something is genuine. Have you dated for a long time? Which a lot of people, don't commonly do. Interracial relationships, they were saying, could be suspicious now. If you can't answer questions, this is a silly example, but sometimes as silly as what is the toothbrush color of your spouse, then somehow your marriage is not genuine. So there's been a real focus on marriage fraud. And one of the big things that's happened as a result is that they introduced what I mentioned before, the conditional permanent resident. So if you sponsor a spouse or common law or conjugal partner, and you put their application in anytime after October 2012, which is pretty much everybody now, and you dated for 2 years or less and you have no children, the person coming to Canada comes as a conditional permanent resident. And what that means is that from the day they land here in Canada, they are required to live, cohabitate with their sponsor in a legitimate type relationship, which is a little bit hard to define. The problem is that they become vulnerable to having to stay in situations if the marriage breaks apart. And many marriages actually break apart in the first 2 years amicably, right? People just don't get along and they break apart. You then have to think what's happening to the person who has the conditional permanent residence, because now they've broken the condition. So does that mean you get removed if you don't stay with someone who doesn't want to be with you? And then more than that, the abuse issue, absolutely. So one thing that we're seeing at our clinic, and a lot of people are seeing this around the country now, is that there are situations where the sponsored person comes in and is abused by the sponsor. And if that person wants to leave, they are obligated now to contact immigration and make an abuse exemption, which is a very lengthy and detailed process, almost like a criminal investigation, it feels like, into proving that, first of all, they lived with their sponsor, and then proving that they were abused just to keep their status, which places people in a lot of danger, potentially.
And in fact, the process itself is very complex, that it might keep people in situations of abuse because of their immigration-related.
Absolutely. I think a lot of permanent residents who are having that condition think long and hard about, what is going to be the better path for them, safety versus immigration status. And those are competing priorities that for everybody, the answer will be different, right?
So this focus on language, and the kind of length and all that stuff, where is it coming from? Is it from a kind of a philosophy of thinking that for you to be a better Canadian, you need to speak English fluently, or you need to, have like, is it the question of commitment that they are trying to address, or is it the commitment? Is it the question of skills? Where is it coming from?
I think it's part of the overall changes to the immigration system and the way we select immigrants, because it's not just about sponsorship, but if you look at the type of immigrants that are coming into Canada, more and more they are coming in as independent class immigrants. The percentage of family class immigrants have shrunk over the years. And you look at the independent class, the language requirement has been on the increase for the last number of years as well. So I think it's the overall trend that the government thinks that, well, you know, we should only let in people who speak English, and so that in the long run, we don't even have to pay for the English class, or, you know, sort of like spend less on settlement. So I think it's like the overall trend is just to let people come in, and then so they can just survive on their own without having, you know, the government or the community support. So I think it's part of that trend as well, yeah.
So coming back to that, it's the family reunification question,
Right.
because, you know, many people who work hard and contribute to the economic prosperity of this country deserve to at least be reunited with their immediate family.
Right.
And, you know, if that is a big question, what is this super visa thing that seniors were introduced to, or parents of were introduced to as a gift to bring them soon, right?
Yeah.
It's become a myth in some ways that
Yeah.
how effective it is. Can you take us through what happened with that? Because we were told in those years is that, you know, this is the faster and more effective way to
Right.
be reunited with your family.
Right. I think traditionally, like even before this government came into power, I think the way we look at family reunification, we see parents, grandparents as a second tier.
Yes.
We never spent any resources to process those applications. So by 2006, and you know, particularly by 2011, when the moratorium came in, there are like hundreds of thousands of applications in the backlog. And so rather than trying to spend more resources to speed up the process to deal with backlog, the government said, well, we just get rid of the backlog altogether by putting a moratorium. And as a result, like, you know, a lot of, because of that lack of attention paid to parents and grandparents, some people had to wait for like 10 years just to have their application processed. So I think it's just part of the overall view that, you know, we don't want as many grandparents and parents, because, you know, by the time they come, they're old, they're not able to work, they're a burden on our society. So that, you know, that kind of a rationale, I think, and thinking behind that. And I think even now, like, you know, they're capping the applications to like only 5,000 a year. But as you said, like, you know, a lot of people come here, even if you come as independent immigrants, you don't have any family here, you want your parents here. And if you have, you know, family, you have your kids, you want your parents to come and be with their grandchildren. So I think this just the overall notion that families are not important is just like, it's hurting our society in the long run.
Yeah. And on from the perspective of the parents who are waiting to come here, they've invested all of their resources into the education of their children, who have actually been educated somewhere else, resourced somewhere else, brought up somewhere else, who are coming here ready to contribute.
Yeah, and
effort,
it's
right?
also
so that acknowledgement is not there in the system.
and to discount the contribution that the current parents and grandparents make, right? In fact, the average age of grandparents, parents, when they come to Canada is around 60 years old. They're not that old. And even if they're not working, they are contributing, because they are helping their families, you know, and if they have grandchildren, they are helping the grandchildren to provide a, you know, a loving support for the kids, right? And then this is all important for our social fabric and for our social cohesion as well.
Yeah,
Definitely.
absolutely.
So before, we're going to take a quick break, but before that, just quickly around the impact of that change of age for children. What does that mean
Yes.
in terms of, you know, what are those changes really targeted at?
I think it takes from Avi's point about not really understanding what family is and the definition of family. And I think people would be surprised that the cutoff age is 19. In fact, I don't think, across communities, across cultures, I no longer think that people think kids are no longer kids at 19.
Yeah.
Right? And we have situations now where we have children in our families who are in full-time school who are over 19, and if you are trying to sponsor any of those kids, they are just not allowed to be sponsored anymore. They will not fit the criteria for family reunification. So you have devastating situations of families who can maybe sponsor half their children and have to leave half their children in the home country, who then at some point down the road, 10, 15, 20 years from now, could maybe come as independent immigrants. But it's just devastating to think that those families cannot be reunified because a child has turned 19. And that's a huge drop from 22 to 19.
And it's kind of contradicting the current reality, like you said. In many families, you know, the kids are staying with their parents because of, you know, labor market related challenges and other things. You know, the child's definition, as even in Eurocentric approaches,
Absolutely.
is not
It transcends,
19, it transcends,
yeah.
right? So,
About 40% of the of families in Canada have kids up to the age of 29 who are still living with their parents. Yeah.
Well, we're going to take a quick commercial break. When we come back, we want to talk a bit about the impact of these changes on particularly racialized communities, low-income communities as well. So let's take a quick commercial break, and we'll be back with the topic.